Hello, Bio 20, Mr. Walker here. This lesson is going to be on what are called biogeochemical cycles. And we'll start by doing a little bit of a review of what we briefly already did talk about, and that is dealing with chemicals and energy. And we did already say that when we talk about energy in the ecosystem, energy flows, whereas chemicals are going to cycle. So this diagram that we're taking a look at, it's using red arrows to show the flow of energy, and we'll see later the blue arrows for the chemical cycling. So we're starting off right at the bottom of this diagram with this yellow blob, which is representing the sun. So from the sun, remember that that energy is going to be captured by the primary producers. That's what we see here, the primary producers. And of course, we're talking about the photosynthesizers. So that can be terrestrial producers like plants, and also aquatic marine producers like the algae. So that energy coming from the sun, a very small percentage, in fact, is going to be captured by the primary producers. And we said before that that's somewhere on the order of 1 to 2% of the energy coming from the sun that is captured by the primary producers, captured by the plants through the process of photosynthesis. Through the cellular processes of plants, a bunch of that energy is going to be, well, lost in the form of heat. And we talked about the fact that it is a huge percentage of the energy that is lost in the form of heat compared to the energy that is passed on to the next trophic level. So the next trophic level that we have in this case here, of course, is going to be the primary consumers. So again, taking a look at the red arrow, we're going to see that from the energy in the primary producers, it's only about 10% of that energy on average that is going to be passed on. And just following up through the trophic levels from the primary consumers, of course, it's going to be passed on to the secondary consumers. Again, at each point along the way, we're seeing that some energy is going to be released, 90% of that energy released in the form of heat. One final trophic level that we have up at the top here, so this is going to be our tertiary consumers that we do have, heat being released along the way. What is going to happen with each one of these, whether it is the primary producers or any level of consumers, all living things eventually do, of course, die. So when they do die, there is still going to be some energy left in that dead organic matter, and we'll just see that being referred to as dendritus. So a whole bunch of energy still available here, energy that can be extracted, energy that can be used, and what it is going to be used by now are going to be the decomposers. So microorganisms for the most part, other what we call detritivores that are going to take that dead and, well, decaying organic matter and use it for their energy purposes. And just like all other living organisms, though, whether it's the producers or the consumers, these decomposers as well are going to be releasing a huge amount of energy in the form of heat. So from all of that energy that initially entered the biosphere through the sun, eventually it is all going to be dissipated in the form of heat and return back out through the atmosphere into outer space in that form. So now if we kind of focus on the chemical cycling, so now it's the blue arrows that we're taking a look at here. So no energy coming from outer space, or sorry, no chemicals coming from outer space, no chemicals coming from the sun that are captured by the primary producers. So we don't have a blue arrow from the sun to the primary producers. So because of that, what we have to have is this continual recycling of the chemicals. There is no input. Remember, Earth is a closed system. Energy can enter, energy can leave, but that is not the case with matter. That's not the case with chemicals. So primary producers, again, we'll just sort of focus on the plants here. They will be taking up the chemicals through the air, carbon through the air. They will be taking up chemicals through the soil. So things like water through the soil, nitrogen through the soil. So these can then be passed on up through the food chain when those producers are consumed. So looking at the blue arrows now, we see that the chemicals passed from the primary producers to the primary consumers, and again up through the food chain, up through the trophic levels to the various different levels of consumers, ending up in the dead organic matter and eventually being taken up and consumed by the decomposers. It is the decomposers that are eventually going to return it back to a form that can now be taken up once again by the plants, by the primary producers. So that's where we do see that the decomposers here are going to play a vital role in terms of taking those chemicals from the various different living organisms and eventually returning them to a form that can be taken up once again by the producers. There are various different processes, as we'll see, that can be involved in the cycling of these chemicals. So some of this language you should be familiar with. Some of these terms are terms that you will be using when you're drawing what are referred to as biogeochemical cycles. Where we find the different chemicals are what are referred to as the reservoirs. So these reservoirs can include living organisms, as we see here, living biological organisms, and after they die, the detritus as well. We see Reservoir B, this is kind of the long-term storage. So if we do have organic materials that are not being decomposed, they're being decomposed at a very, very slow rate, eventually it can lead to the formation of coal, oil, and peat. And we have some other reservoirs at the bottom here as well. Other parts of the biosphere. So the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, parts of the lithosphere in the soil, parts of the lithosphere over here as well in Reservoir D in the form of the rocks. So what we have to have is the movement between these various different reservoirs, and we see a whole bunch of terms here, which is how we have the movement from one reservoir to another. So how, for example, do we get the minerals, the chemicals that we find in the rocks, in the bedrock, in the crust of the earth, how do we get it into other parts of the biosphere? Well, it can be through these processes of weathering and through the process of erosion. We can also have movement in the opposite direction. So from the water, for example, we can have sedimentation that is taking place and eventually the formation of sedimentary rocks. A few other processes that are identified up above here that are going to be very important in terms of the cycling: photosynthesis, movement between plants and the atmosphere primarily, respiration, movement between other living organisms, including animals, plants, bacteria, going between the atmosphere and these living organisms, decomposition, excretion. This is a big one here in terms of one of the cycles that we're going to talk about, referred to as the carbon cycle and the burning of fossil fuels, moving it from one reservoir very quickly to another reservoir. And the last one that we have up here, fossilization. We're going to come across some other ones as well, ones related to the water cycle, terms that you've seen before, things like evaporation, precipitation, sublimation. So there are some other terms also involved in the cycling of matter. So biogeochemical cycles, there are several of these that you will need to know about. So what exactly do we mean by this term biogeochemical cycles? Well, this prefix bio here is referring to, well, living organisms, living biological organisms, the biotic realm. That includes things that are living or were once living, so they could be dead as well. If we're talking about a tree that is no longer living, for example, that is still biotic. Keep in mind as well that it's not just the big things, it's not just the plants and the animals, but it's the small microscopic things as well. So the protists, the bacteria, the archaea, they are also part of the biotic realm. Geo, we're really talking about, well, geology. We're talking about the Earth's crust, we're talking about the rocks, and here what we're talking about is inorganic material associated with the Earth's crust. Chemicals, the chemicals we'll focus on here, because it is biology, is the chemicals that are essential for life. So that for sure includes things like carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, hydrogen. Those will be some of the important ones. Cycles, well, it's going to follow in a circular path because these chemicals do have to be used over and over again. That is what we're going to see is the circular movement, and that is where this entire term, biogeochemical cycles, is really coming from. And just a reminder that when we are talking about energy, energy is going to flow really in one direction through the biosphere. Input from the sun, and when we're talking about nutrients, we don't have an input coming from some other source. We have a finite supply, so we have to have the cycling and recycling of those nutrients. So reservoirs, you should know what is meant by a reservoir. It's where we do find a large amount of these different chemicals, and you should know what those reservoirs are and how significant they are for each of the different biogeochemical cycles. So major reservoirs, the atmosphere. So gases that you find in the atmosphere, the lithosphere, another part of the biosphere, the rocks and the minerals, hydrosphere, mostly the oceans, two-thirds of the planet again covered by the oceans. But don't forget about the lakes, the streams, the rivers, and groundwater, actually fairly important there as well. And finally, the living organisms, the biotic world, the plants and the animals and so forth, both living and dead. So for each one of the different cycles, what you will need to know about is what are the different chemical forms. What are the major reservoirs? What are the processes involved? What is the cycling pattern? What are the arrows that are showing the movement from one reservoir to another? And what are the human impacts? So in terms of the biogeochemical cycles that you will need to know about, one is one that you have seen before, and that is the water cycle. So for the water cycle, well, what are the chemical forms? This one's pretty straightforward, but remember that there are different phases, solid, liquid, and gas, and we can find that water in different reservoirs, not just in the hydrosphere. What are the processes? I mentioned some of the processes, some of them including precipitation, evaporation, sublimation, will be some of those involved. Cycling patterns, from which reservoir is it coming from, where is it going to, and of course it may be going in either direction, and what are the human impacts that we have? What are some of the things that we are doing that is influencing the cycling of the water going from one reservoir to another? So here we're not necessarily talking about water pollution, we're not talking about acid deposition, we're talking about impacts on the actual cycling, the processes involved in the water cycle. Other ones are going to be the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, the carbon cycle, which quite often goes along with the oxygen cycle, and finally, just a little bit about the sulfur cycle. So for each one of these, usually what I ask you to do is make a sketch for me. Make a sketch that shows all of these different processes. So what I like you to do is draw a picture very similar to this. In fact, for all of the cycles, you can draw one like this. So what I'm showing here, this is going to be the lithosphere. Up here, we'll put the atmosphere. Over here, we'll put the hydrosphere. And we should also have some biological organisms in here. I'm not going to try and draw them. I'm just going to write the words. I'm just going to write plants or trees that we'll find up here on the land. We'll also have some plants, aquatic plants that we'll find in the water. We'll have some animals. So we can put some animals over here that we'll have on the land, animals that we'll have in the water as well. So the idea is that between these different components of the biosphere, you need to show using arrows the movement of particular chemicals going from one region to another. So we might talk about the movement of chemicals going from the atmosphere that's taken up by plants, that moves to the animals, that eventually makes its way to the lithosphere, makes its way down to the groundwater. We might have some groundwater here. And from the groundwater, it might make its way eventually into the hydrosphere. So this would show the cycling, and for each one of these, you should also be able to identify what is the name of that process that is involved. And finally, what is the human impact? So is there something that we are doing that's going to increase this process, where we're taking a chemical from the atmosphere and moving it into the plants and the trees, the primary producers, or is there something that we're doing that's decreasing that cycling process? So again, let me just emphasize once again that for each one of these different biogeochemical cycles, the different chemical forms that are important, the major reservoir, in some cases just one, in other cases it may be more than one, the cycling processes involved, the cycling patterns, the arrows, and what the human impacts are going to be on that biogeochemical cycle.